Hey everyone, this is the first section of The Latest Deception by Gavril Myasnikov. It's from 1930. Here we go. The first section is titled "A Few Words About Those Who Are No Longer With Us" in lieu of an introduction. In September 1843, Marx wrote to Ruga, quote, "Hitherto philosophers have had the solution of all riddles lying in their writing desks, and the stupid exoteric world had only to open its mouth for the roast pigeons of absolute knowledge to fly into it. Now philosophy has become mundane, ... But, if constructing the future and settling everything for all times are not our affair, it is all the more clear that what we have to accomplish at present. I am referring to ruthless criticism of all that exists, ruthless both in the sense of not being afraid of the results it arrives at, and in the sense of being just as little afraid of conflict with the powers that be." End quote. Marx. This critical perspective of one of the future authors of the Manifesto completely coincides with that of its author, Friedrich Engels, as we may verify in one of his passionate articles in which he exhaustively examines the vision of Carlyle. Quote, "Carlyle has, as he himself admits, no, quote, Morrison's pill, no panacea for curing the ills of society." End quote. Engels. Quote, "In that, too, he is right. All social philosophy, as long as social philosophy still propounds a few principles as its final conclusion, as long as social philosophy continues to administer Morrison's pills, remains very imperfect. It is not the bare conclusions of which we are in such need, but rather study. The conclusions are nothing without the reasoning that has led up to them. This we have known since Hegel, and the conclusions are worse than useless if they are final in themselves, if they are not turned into premises for further deductions. But the conclusion must also assume a distinct form for a time. They must, in the course of development, evolve from vague imprecision into clear ideas." End quote. Engels. Footnote. Friedrich Engels, Review of Past and Present by Thomas Carlyle. End footnote. After these lines were first written, the social philosophy of Marx and Engels evolved, leading to the celebrated conclusions that were first laid down in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, and were then more fully developed in the later works of its authors. No one can say that these conclusions are imprecise. If Engels was right, moreover, when he said that we do not have to confer as much importance on the conclusions, but rather on the process from which they arose, and that in general conclusions are nothing but a temporary formula, we can ask ourselves, have the conclusions arrived at in the Manifesto been superseded? Have the subsequent developments perhaps shown that they were false? An astute Frenchman once said that he did not attempt to reason like Voltaire in an era when Voltaire himself would have reasoned in a different way. If we do nothing but repeat what Marx and Engels said in an epoch when Marx and Engels would have themselves thought in a different way, we would thus reveal our total inability to instill ourselves with the vivifying critique that is contained in their teachings, defending their letter rather than the spirit of their works. We would be even more far removed from the spirit of the work of Marx than those dogmatists whom Marx himself refers to in his letter to Ruga, quoted above. Quote, "Marx and Engels had ruthless criticism for everything that existed and had no fear of the results of that criticism," end quote. Plekhanov said, quote, "The followers of Marx and Engels, too, should have no fear of the results achieved by their teachers. One would think that all this goes without saying, and that it is quite superfluous to speak on the matter, ... End quote. Plekhanov. Nowadays, however, this perspective is considered to be erroneous. Today, this is no longer so obvious, which is why commentaries are necessary. For now the highest virtue consists in having a blind faith in the wisdom of the, quote, philosophers, of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the All-Russian Communist Party, who, quote, have had the solution of all riddles lying in their writing desks, and the stupid exoteric proletarians had only to open their mouths for the roast pigeons of absolute knowledge to fly into them, end quote. Marx. Or, I don't know if Marx said in the first thing, the proletarians. He says the exoteric. But, you get the idea. He only said exoteric in the first one. Here he says exoteric proletarians had only to open their mouths for the roast pigeons of absolute knowledge to fly into them. End quote. Talk is not superfluous when all criticism of the party line or of the Central Committee are considered to be Menshevik, whether they come from the left or the right, and entail the usual consequences for those who dare to express them. It is not true that the Central Committee does not have any kind of, quote, Morrison's pill, no panacea for curing the ills of society, end quote. Since, if this were the case, it would welcome criticism as the duty of every Marxist, of every revolutionary, and not as something that is the work of sinister criminals. And the fact that the Central Committee's membership is composed exclusively of dogmatists of the kind that Marx described, and who, according to Plekhanov, are even more alien to Marx, this dear father of Russian Marxism does not bother anyone at all. To the contrary, this gives you the right, dear G.V. Plekhanov, to say that, quote, followers, ... should have no fear of the results achieved by their teachers, end quote. We, however, who, following your example, have sought to criticize the, quote, results formulated by the disciples of Marx and Engels, have suffered and continue to suffer adverse consequences when we proclaim our, quote, results. But as you have taught us, with the example of Marx and Engels, who were not afraid of, quote, coming into conflict with the powers that be, end quote, we have decided to continue to urge just as Marx and Engels would have done if they were in our place. We have continued to argue. Just as Marx and Engels would have done if they were in our place. And we have done so because, quote, the conscious workers who are in the vanguard of the movement must constantly look over their shoulders to the road that the workers' movement has just left behind, in order to ask themselves over and over again if they are following the right road and if there is a better way, end quote. And also because, quote, only idiots and those who fear the participation of the broad masses in politics think that open and impassioned debates on tactics, of the kind that one can constantly read in the workers' press, are vain and inopportune. In reality, it is these very same debates that attract the attention of the workers, inviting the workers to examine their politics from every angle in order to find a clear but not narrow class line for the movement, end quote. Footnote. The quotations in this paragraph are translated from the Spanish translation, as the source could not be identified and an existing translation could not be located. End footnote. As another disciple of Marx and Engels said in 1900, when you wrote your, quote, preface, who was at that time your comrade and friend? Lenin. Elsewhere, Lenin wrote, quote, in the press, one may find arguments and polemics that help the reader to understand political positions, to have a better grasp of their meaning in order to be able to improve them later. And there are also arguments that degenerate into insults, slanders, and disputes. The more conscious workers, those who are aware of their responsibilities with regard to the task of transformation and organization of the proletariat, must pay the greatest attention so that these inevitable debates and these necessary polemics do not degenerate into insults, slanders, and calumnies. End quote. Footnote. Translated from the Spanish translation. Lenin thought that the lack of political education, quote, of the Russians, end quote, was manifested, among other ways, by their inability to find precise and well-argued demonstrations in important historical debates, as well as in a naive faith in vulgar slogans and gestures, in threats and in the oaths of the parties involved. Quote, every rational being understands that over the course of a debate that has been poisoned by this or that theme, in order to arrive at the truth, one has to go beyond the arguments of the parties involved, taking into account the facts and the documents, and discerning to what degree the testimonies are reliable. Of course, this is not an easy task. It is much easier to consider whatever we hear or want to hear to be the real McCoy, depending on how loud it is. Anyone who abides by this practice is a mental defective who does not deserve any respect. If you want to have a serious position, the truth will not be discerned without a certain amount of personal investigation, and anyone who is afraid of this task deprives himself of any possibility of reaching the truth. End quote. Lenin. And we can add that the same thing is true of anyone who is afraid to criticize the conclusions formulated by Marx and Engels, Plekhanov, Lenin, and the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party. Lenin said, quote, Comrade Chudnovsky said here that he had, quote, taken the liberty, end quote, of making some sharp criticisms of the Commissar's actions. There can be no question at all as to whether or not sharp criticism is to be allowed, for it is a revolutionary's duty to engage in such criticism, and the people's commissars do not claim to be infallible, end quote. Lenin. Footnote. Grigory Chudnovsky lived from 1890 to 1918. Member of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party since 1905, he belonged to the Menshevik fraction. In 1917, he joined the Bolsheviks together with the Mezryantsy, which is Trotsky's group, is kind of like in between Bolshevism and Menshevism. Maybe not like a hybrid, but kind of like a people who are like kind of like independent socialist radicals. Chudnovsky participated in the October Revolution. Chudnovsky was a member of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, the Central Executive Committee of all of Russia. He died in combat during the Civil War. End footnote. Paris, 1931. Okay, so that has been the first section of Gavriil Myasnikov's 1930 piece, Latest Deception. The section that I just read was titled A Few Words About Those Who Are No Longer With Us, parenthesis, in lieu of an introduction, end parenthesis. Okay, so actually the last bit was another introduction. So this is section 1 of The Latest Deception by Gavriil Myasnikov. It's the first section of The Latest Deception. The section is titled The Bureaucracy's Deceitfulness and the Proletariat. All the workers and peasants, whether they know how to read or not, have heard the deafening howls and uproar of the professional bureaucrats of the Party Soviet concerning self-criticism. The newspapers and magazines spit and rage, demanding that the dissidents, the workers, peasants, and intellectual opposition, should be eliminated, appealing to iron and blood, to retaliations urbi et urbi. But after having dragged thousands of workers, peasants, and intellectuals to prison or deportation in the, quote, socialist fatherland, these gangsters of the bureaucracy are now making a terrible ruckus with this business about, quote, criticism, quote, self-criticism, and, quote, implacable criticism from top to bottom, end quote. What is happening here? These gangsters who are the ones who make all the important decisions in this country, with its millions of people behind the backs of the proletarians and peasants, in their ministerial sanctuaries, the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the USSR, parenthesis, Bolshevik, whose decrees are more infallible than the edicts of the Holy Synod, These gangsters who have done away with so many workers, peasants, and intellectuals without any kind of public trial, without allowing them the right to defend themselves, employing kangaroo courts and torture chambers, because these honest revolutionaries had the audacity to have their own opinions and express their own opinions. These bureaucrats, whose acts of repression are more cruel than the most degrading and abject deeds of the bourgeois governments. Parenthesis, Bela Kun. If you don't know who Bela Kun is, Bela Kun was like the main leader of the Hungarian revolution, the Hungarian Soviet Republic that was very short-lived. Parenthesis, Bela Kun was condemned to 3 months in prison by a bourgeois court, and the organizer of a prison escape, Comrade Braun, was given a 6-month sentence, end parenthesis, are the same ones who are now suddenly advocating self-criticism. The workers and intellectuals, whether or not they are members of the party, are stupefied and bemused by this clamorous hypocrisy. Does it represent a 180-degree change of course? Does it mean that the workers, peasants, and intellectuals who disagree with the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolshevik, will no longer be subjected to secret reprisals? And where the hell am I? Secret reprisals will not be imprisoned without a trial in the dungeons of the GPU because of the positions they advocate in meetings and in the press? Does it mean that from now on the proclamations of the bureaucracy of the Politburo of the Communist Party Soviet Union Bolsheviks will no longer be infallible and will no longer be off limits to all criticism? Does this mean that the gangsters of the bureaucracy, who meet in ecclesiastical conclaves, parenthesis, that is, in party congresses, end parenthesis, will now be subject to criticism, and that if they are opposed by a majority, they will have to alter their decisions? No, of course not. All this talk of self-criticism is only the latest deception of the bureaucracy. The bitter disillusionment of the working class and peasant masses caused by the arbitrary tyranny of the bureaucrats, by their betrayals, their deceitfulness, and their inability to perform the simplest task, supplying bread to the cities in a country that is an exporter of grain. This disillusionment is so profound that the bureaucracy organized into a ruling class that exercises command over production, distribution, and the state, believes that it has not inflicted enough repression on the workers, peasants, and intellectuals of the opposition, and it seems that now the ground is shaking under its feet. That is why it is howling like mad against, quote, bureaucratism, and in favor of, quote, self-criticism. Evidently, this, quote, criticism and, quote, self-criticism must ultimately benefit the bureaucracy. It must culminate in reinforcing its power and its rule, winnowing from its ranks the most notorious and corrupt embezzlers and bandits, those for whom the workers and peasants have expressed the greatest hatred, and thus divert the discontent against the system of bureaucratic rule towards more anodyne targets. The hell does that mean? Is that a typo or is that a word that I don't know? Anodyne, not likely to provoke dissent or offensive, inoffensive, often deliberately so. The minor misappropriations of low-level bureaucrats, small-time bureaucratic chicanery. The bureaucracy praises the, quote, honest bureaucrats, calling upon the workers and peasants to collaborate in the task of cleaning up the mess. These are the limits of, quote, criticism and, quote, self-criticism, and anyone who deviates from them is persecuted with all available means: blackmail, calumny, discreet pressure applied at the headquarters of the GPU, deportation, and prison. The working class, the agricultural wage workers, and the honest proletarian intellectuals will fight to break the rule of the bureaucracy by destroying the bureaucratic machinery, by overthrowing the bureaucratic machinery's power in production and replacing it with that of the councils of workers' delegates in the workplaces, who will elect the organs of industrial management. The directorial staff of the industrial sectors and the councils of administration and the National Economic Council of the Soviet Union will simultaneously institute these councils as the, quote, working class cornerstone of state power, end quote. The original program of the Communist Party Soviet Union Bolsheviks They will fight to evict the bureaucracy from all commercial activities, to abolish all the national commissariats of commerce, the commercial organizations of the state, and to transfer all the capital rights and responsibilities of these institutions to the cooperatives. They will fight to expel the bureaucracy from the leading positions of the state and to transfer all the rights and prerogatives of the bureaucratic workers and peasants inspectorate to the trade unions. They will fight for a workers' state, for the dictatorship of the proletariat, and for workers' democracy, knowing that the bureaucracy is incapable of eliminating, even minimally, fraud, bribery, arbitrariness, tyranny, and the oppression and exploitation of the working class and peasant masses. And even while the proletariat fights for immediate objectives in its everyday struggles, for the suppression of the worst aspects of bureaucratic rule, for higher wages, better working conditions, and other similar reforms of the social bureaucracy, while they are fighting against these bureaucratic evils, the proletariat must understand the very nature of these evils, whose essence is state capitalism itself, the very structure of the social bureaucratic system. On the destruction of this system and its replacement by a workers' state will destroy the bureaucracy at its very roots. Okay, so that's the end of section 1. The bureaucracy's deceitfulness and the proletariat. Section 2. Bureaucratic deception, present and past. This is not the first time that the social bureaucracy has raised the alarm with this business of criticism and self-criticism, and with the democracy of the councils and the proletariat trying to dissimulate the social bureaucracy's fear of the growing discontent of the working class and peasant masses, as well as its repression of the dissident workers, peasants, and intellectuals behind a radical propaganda campaign of love and peace. We all remember the ferocious repression of 1923 against the proletarians of the workers' group of the Communist Party Soviet Union Bolsheviks, whose crimes can be summarized under the rubrics of having criticized the theory and practice of the bureaucracy in the manifesto of the workers' group, for having denounced, quote, accumulation, and for the fact of existing as an organized group. And we all remember the repression, just as ferocious, secret, and subterranean, as is the way of the GPU, which was inflicted upon them by the bureaucracy, them being the workers' group, which was all the while talking about Soviet democracy and proletarian democracy. We can all recall that subsequently in 1924 to 1925, when the discontent of the working class and peasant masses took the form of strikes and spontaneous uprisings, the bureaucracy endlessly repeated the watchwords of, quote, criticism and, quote, self-criticism. Thus, at the 13th Party Conference in Moscow in January 1925, Stalin, who is currently at the head of the bureaucratic leadership, declared, quote, the issue is as follows. Either we, the entire party, allow the non-party peasants and workers to criticize us, or we shall be criticized by means of revolts. The revolt in Georgia was criticism. The revolt in Tambov was also criticism. The revolt in Kronstadt was not that criticism? One thing or other. Either we abandon this official optimism and official approach to the matter, do not fear criticism and allow ourselves to be criticized by the non-party workers and peasants, who, after all, are the ones to feel the effects of our mistakes, or we do not do this, and discontent will accumulate and grow, and we shall have criticism in the form of revolts, end quote. Stalin, Pravda number 24, January 30th, 1925. Can we not detect in this speech the portrait of a miserable, frightened, and panic-stricken bureaucracy that has just noticed the wave of working class and peasant discontent, and which, when the workers and peasants have been pacified thanks to a campaign of lies, provocations, blackmail, and violence, promises to continue to deceive them? Quote, the revolts of Tambov, Georgia, Kronstadt, were, and criticism, end quote. The criticism of the workers and peasants took the form of revolts and strikes because until then, the workers and peasants did not have the right to express any kind of criticism, written or oral, of the policy of the ruling bureaucracy and the ruling bureaucracy's party. Stalin knew this and continued as follows, quote, either we, allow ourselves, bracket, the bureaucracy, end bracket, to be criticized by the non-party workers and peasants, or we do not do this, and discontent will accumulate and grow, and we shall have criticism in the form of revolts, end quote. Stalin. Which means that Stalin, the leader who is at the head of the bureaucracy, admits that prior to 1925, the workers and peasants did not have any political rights. Freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, of political and trade union organization. They were dispossessed of all freedom of criticism. The tyranny and violence of the bureaucracy know no bounds. That is why the workers and peasants who suffer bodily from the policies of Stalin and co. were driven by desperation and decided to express their discontent by way of uprisings and strikes. Quote, either we abandon this official optimism and official approach to the matter, do not fear criticism, and allow ourselves to be criticized by the non-party workers and peasants, who, after all, are the ones to feel the effects of our mistakes, or we do not do this, and discontent will accumulate and grow, and we shall have criticism in the form of revolts, end quote. Stalin. The bureaucracy as a whole, and the bureaucracy's leaders, are spewing radical phraseology of love and peace, while at the same time confessing that they are compelled to do so, given the increasing discontent of workers and peasants, which could lead to revolt. In the meantime, the desk jockey-in-chief calls upon his bureaucratic peers to repudiate their privileges in bureaucratic ways. That is, he exhorts them to rid themselves of their petty bourgeois bureaucratic nature. Evidently, that was that. And the leader himself, as well as his whole gang of desk jockeys, remain the same bureaucrat that he always had been. What does stand out in this concession made by the panic-stricken bureaucrat-in-chief is the fact that, quote, bureaucratic desk jockey, end quote, conduct had led to the emergence of internal dissent. In the meanwhile, criticism from the workers and peasants, whether from the left or the right, regardless of its political position, was considered as Menshevik and counter-revolutionary by these bureaucrats and these bureaucrats' party, and silently, concealed from the sight of the proletariat, it is quite effectively dealt with in the prisons of the GPU. But this was not enough to save the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy's leaders were obliged to openly call for the repudiation of bureaucratic methods and for the toleration of criticism. In order to prevent bureaucratic conduct, the violent and arbitrary rule over the peasants and the workers, from being criticized by way of uprisings and strikes. Quote, the whole trouble, comrades, end quote, Stalin went on, quote, is that many of our comrades do not understand or do not want to understand how extremely important this question is. It is often said, our leaders in Moscow have made it the fashion to talk about the peasantry. Probably they don't mean it seriously. It is diplomacy. Moscow needs these speeches to be made for the outside world, but we can continue the old policy, end quote. Stalin. Quote, I think, comrades, that of all the dangers that face us, this failure of our local responsible workers to understand the tasks before us is the most serious danger. One thing or the other, either our local comrades will realize how very serious the question of the peasantry is, in which case they will really set about drawing the peasantry into our constructive work, improving peasant economy and strengthening the bond, or the comrades will fail to realize it, in which case things may end in collapse of the Soviet power, end quote. Footnote. The English translation of this paragraph and the preceding one were taken from the document available at Marxist.org. The text of the second paragraph as provided in the Spanish translation is, however, substantially unlike the English translation provided at Marxist.org. and an English translation of the Spanish translation of the passage in question is provided here for reference. Quote, the biggest problem, is that the local cadres think the new policy is not a new policy, but a ruse to deceive foreign countries, and in the meantime continue to behave in their usual manner, and do not perceive the criticism of the workers and peasants, of the right or of the left, as anything but Menshevism or counter-revolution, and treat it in the same way that they have done all along until now. End quote. Perhaps this paragraph is a recapitulation by the author, Myasnikov, rather than an excerpt from Stalin's speech. Bracket, American translator's note, end bracket. End footnote. Stalin knew perfectly well that not even his comrades believed him, since these discourses of, quote, peace and love, end quote, concerning the freedom of criticism had already repeatedly been used to deceive the workers and peasants. The local cadres looked upon the latest display of concern about freedom as merely the latest trick, another turn of the screw to deceive the workers and peasants. And that is exactly what it was. If freedom of criticism has been granted to the workers and peasants since 1925, why did we witness another round of talk about, quote, criticism and, quote, self-criticism in 1928? Up until that point, they had tried to pull the wool over the eyes of the workers and peasants by speaking to them about their right to, quote, criticism. Now they even speak about, quote, self-criticism as well. And the problem is not restricted to the fact that the workers and peasants who are not members of the party are not permitted to criticize the all-powerful bureaucracy. That is, to publish newspapers, magazines, and books of a non-bureaucratic nature, to express themselves at meetings, to organize in groups and parties, and to participate in the elections in opposition to the party bureaucracy. It is rather that criticism is not even permitted to the party comrades themselves, and when they do express their dissenting opinions, in an attempt to advocate their position and to convince a majority within the party, they are ferociously and viciously attacked, in a way that would provoke envy among the brutal Italian fascists, who usually prosecuted communists in public trials. In Russia, however, trials are only for thieves, murderers, rapists, embezzlers, white guards, generals, and capitalists and their gunmen, while the dissident workers, peasants, and intellectuals are quietly eliminated in the dungeons of the GPU. And until the most basic rights are granted to the dissident workers, peasants, and intellectuals, such as a public trial and protection under the law, something that is even enjoyed by every kind of common law criminal, as well as spies, agents provocateurs, policemen, generals, etc., while the dissident workers, peasants, and intellectuals are quietly eliminated in the cells of the GPU without the right to legal defense, because they are sentenced by a sham court. Until that time, neither the workers nor the peasants will be able to believe the bureaucracy and the bureaucracy's leaders when they claim that they will permit freedom of criticism. Until then, all the discourses about, quote, criticism and, quote, self-criticism will be nothing but so many lies sewn together with the white threads of provocation. In 1925, the bureaucracy launched the slogan of the right of the workers and peasants to enjoy freedom of criticism. In 1928, it was the turn of the slogan of self-criticism. The value of these campaigns has not changed, however, since 1925, as well as in 1928. The GPU continued eliminating those same dissident workers, peasants, and intellectuals, and dragging them off to those same fake courts, where they have no right to mount a legal defense. And as long as these workers, peasants, and intellectuals are still rotting in prison and in internal exile, without the right to a public defense, no one will swallow the wishes and promises of Stalin and co., which are nothing but the latest bureaucratic deception. That's the end of section 2. Section 3. The division of labor in the bureaucracy. At the right time or the wrong time, with or without excuses,
The bureaucratic leaders of the Central Committee of the Communist Party Soviet Union Bolsheviks expressed their love for the proletariat and denounced the bureaucratic plague. They always promised to put an end to the inefficiency of the bureaucratic state apparatus by introducing workers and peasants into the state machinery. And what this amounts to is that some peasant and intellectual bureaucrats are dismissed and replaced with new worker bureaucrats, who can offer the experience of their working class origins. Just as the president of the German Republic, the former Saddler Ebert, his prime minister, the former carpenter Scheidemann, and his minister of war, the former metal worker Noska, etc., changed nothing in the bureaucratic nature of the German state, nothing about the bureaucratic nature of the social bureaucratic state capitalist system will be changed by promoting workers to posts as desk jockeys, just as it is necessary in order to transform the bourgeois state into a proletarian state, quote, to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, end quote. So, too, in order to transform the social bureaucratic state from a state capitalist system into a worker state, it is necessary for the proletariat to play the role of the ruling class. The difference lies in the fact that in a society of private capitalism, the proletariat expels the bourgeoisie from its commanding position over production and distribution, placing the management of all industry in the hands of the councils of workers' delegates in the workplaces and all of exchange into the hands of the cooperatives in order to ensure distribution, and transforming the trade unions into organs of state control over the council of workers' delegates in the workplace and over their cooperatives. In a state capitalist system, the working class expels the bureaucracy from the leadership over production and distribution, replacing the bureaucrats, the directors and their assistants, etc., with the councils of workers' delegates in the workplaces, which control production, and with the cooperatives that assume responsibility for distribution, and the trade unions that will be responsible for overseeing those institutions. In a society of private capitalism, the proletariat overthrows the bourgeoisie from the bourgeoisie's ruling position as the ruling class, but in a system of state capitalism, the ruling class is the bureaucracy. In a society of private capitalism, the apparatus of the bourgeois state is destroyed, while here we have to destroy the bureaucratic state apparatus. The bourgeoisie combats the attempts of the proletariat to become the ruling class, and the bureaucracy combats and will continue to combat the attempts of the proletariat oriented towards the same goal. The bourgeoisie defends its class rule, and so does the bureaucracy. The social traders of the Second International and of the Amsterdam International, while defending bourgeois rule, proclaim as loudly as possible that they are fighting for socialism, just as the social bureaucrats of the Politburo defend state capitalism while appealing to the defense of socialism and the worker state. What is it that the bourgeoisie does not want? The transformation of the proletariat into the ruling class. The transformation of the councils of workers' delegates in the workplaces into the administrative organs of production and into the, quote, foundation of state power, end quote, program of the Communist Party Soviet Union, and of the cooperatives into the administrative organs of distribution. And the bourgeoisie does not want this to happen because this would mean the end of its own existence. And what is it that Stalin and co. do not want either, even if they proclaim as loudly as possible that they are defending the participation of workers in the affairs of the state and communism? As soon as one asks this question, everything becomes clear. All the beautiful words and noble phrases about communism, about the dictatorship of the proletariat, instantly become obvious swindles for all the workers, lies woven with the white thread of the most absolute hypocrisy. The Stalins, the Bukharins, etc., do not want councils of workers' delegates to be formed in the workplaces, nor do the Stalins and Bukharins want them to take control over production, nor do the Stalins and Bukharins want the cooperatives to assume responsibility for exchange and for the rights, the duties, and the capital of the People's Commissariat for Commerce and of the state agencies for trade, nor did the Stalins and Bukharins want all the functions of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate to be transferred to the trade unions. And the Stalins and Bukharins do not want these things to happen for the same reason the bourgeoisie does not want them to happen. Both defend their respective states and their egoistic class interests, while they dissimulate this defense with noble phrases. If the councils of workers' delegates in the workplaces are the institutions that are supposed to administer the industries of the state according to a general plan that embraces every sector of industry, thus becoming the, quote, foundation of state power, as set forth in the program of the Communist Party Soviet Union Bolsheviks, and if the cooperatives are supposed to take control of all the commerce of the state, and of all the rights and duties of the commercial agencies of the state, and if the trade unions are supposed to take control of the rights and duties of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate, then what kind of party will have to guide the organized proletariat towards these goals? A workers' party or a bourgeois party? A workers' party, of course. And what kind of party is it, on the other hand, that fights with every possible means against the transformation of the proletariat into the ruling class, situated at the controlling center of production, distribution, overall supervision, and the state? It is an anti-worker and anti-proletarian party. If it were a party that defends the private capitalist system, it would be a bourgeois party, but this party defends the state capitalist system. It is a bureaucratic party, and those who try to prevent the proletariat from becoming the ruling class are standing in the way of the struggle against the bureaucracy, and by trying to cut short any criticism, self-criticism, and the struggle against bureaucratism, they reveal their class nature. One part of the bureaucrats manages production, one part commerce, and a third is engaged in both, while a fourth exercises draconian rule over the bureaucracy, criticism, and self-criticism. This division of labor of the bureaucrats is obvious, and of course contributes to the reinforcement of their economic and political power, which entails the physical and spiritual slavery of the proletariat. That's the end of Section 3, the division of labor in the bureaucracy. This is Section 4, the proletarian revolution and the proletarian state. Quote, the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class to win the battle of democracy, end quote. Marx and Engels wrote in the Manifesto. A proletarian revolution is a revolution in which, in the proletarian revolution's first stage, the proletariat is transformed into the ruling class, assuming control over production and distribution. How can the proletariat become the ruling class? How should the proletariat organize to achieve this goal? In the Manifesto, Marx and Engels write that in order to fulfill the proletariat's historic mission as gravedigger of the bourgeoisie, the proletariat cannot organize as a class except by way of association. This meant that only if all the proletarians are collectively engaged while the proletariat successfully attain the level of ruling class and seize all the functions of management of production and distribution, that were in the hands of the bourgeoisie prior to the advent of the proletarian revolution, which will transform the proletariat into the economically dominant class. By seizing control over the entire apparatus of the administration of production and distribution, by transferring this apparatus into the hands of all the associated producers, the proletariat would not thereby cease to be the productive class that labors, a collective that labors. The proletariat collectively organized, manages production, and is itself responsible for overseeing the labor process. This self-organization, this self-managed labor, Marx referred to as workers' cooperation, as a corporation, a college. By studying the experience of the Paris Commune, Marx and Engels are able to provide a clear and practical explanation of what Marx and Engels understood by the idea of the proletariat becoming the ruling class. Quote, ... By far the most important decree of the Commune instituted an organization of large-scale industry and even a manufacture which was to not only be based on the association of the workers in each factory, but also to combine all these associations in one great union. In short, an organization which, as Marx quite rightly says in the Civil War, must necessarily have led in the end to communism, that is to say, the direct opposite of the Proudhon doctrine. End quote. Parenthesis, Engels, Preface to the Civil War in France. End parenthesis. Marx and Engels categorically stated that only this kind of proletarian organization, under the form of councils of workers' delegates in the workplaces, united into one immense trade union that would embrace all the factory and workshop councils, would necessarily lead to communism. Quote, its true secret was this: it was essentially a working-class government, the produce of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating class, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economic emancipation of labor. End quote. Marx. Quote, except on this last condition, the communal constitution would have been an impossibility and a delusion. The political rule of the producer cannot coexist with the perpetuation of the producer's social slavery. The commune was therefore to serve as a lever for uprooting the economical foundations upon which rests the existence of classes and therefore of class rule. End quote. Marx, The Civil War in France. This all-inclusive collective, quote, association of the proletariat of all workplaces eliminated the power of the bourgeois owners and exploiters, organized in a collective association in the councils of workers' delegates in the workplaces. The proletariat assumed control over production, thus transforming this association into the, quote, foundation of the state. This is how the economic foundations upon which the very existence of classes, and therefore class rule, is based, is overthrown. Without these conditions, the commune, the workers' state, is inconceivable. It would be an empty shell and would be transformed into an imposture. The secret of the commune consists in the fact that the commune was the, quote, association of the proletariat that administered production and the organization of labor. An organization like the councils of workers' delegates in the workplaces would thus necessarily lead to communism. This is the long-sought form of political organization that will make the economic liberation of labor possible. This is the only road to communism. In The State and Revolution, Lenin wrote, quote, a witty German social democrat of the 70s of the last century called the postal service an example of the socialist economic system. This is very true. At the present, the postal service is a business organized on the lines of state capitalist monopoly. Imperialism is gradually transforming all trusts into organizations of a similar type, in which, standing over the, quote, common people who are overworked and starved, one has the same bourgeois bureaucracy. But the mechanism of social management is here already to hand. Once you have overthrown the capitalists, crushed the resistance of these exploiters with the iron hand of the armed workers, and smashed the bureaucratic machinery of the modern state, we shall have a splendidly equipped mechanism, freed from the, quote, parasite, a mechanism which can very well be set going by the united workers themselves, who will hire technicians, foremen, and accountants, and pay them all, as indeed all, quote, state officials in general, workmen's wages. Here is a concrete practical task which can immediately be fulfilled in relation to all trust, a task whose fulfillment will rid the working people of exploitation, a task which takes account of what the commune had already begun to practice, parenthesis, particularly in building up the state, end parenthesis. This is what will bring about the abolition of parliamentarism and the preservation of representative institutions, bracket, that is, the Soviets, end bracket. This is what will rid the laboring classes of the bourgeoisie's prostitution of these institutions, end quote. Lenin. In Kautsky's debate with Lenin on the question of the proletarian state, Kautsky says, quote, The most varied form of enterprises, bureaucratic, bracket, question mark, in bracket, trade unionist, cooperative, private, can exist side by side in socialist society. There are, for example, enterprises which cannot do without a bureaucrat, bracket, question mark, and bracket. Without a bureaucratic, bracket, question mark, and bracket, organization, such as the railways. Here, the democratic organization may take the following shape. The workers elect delegates who form a sort of parliament, which establishes the working regulations and supervises the management of the bureaucratic apparatus. The management of other countries may be transferred to the trade unions, and still others may become cooperative enterprises. End quote. That is what Kautsky said. Quote, "This argument is erroneous," end quote. Lenin objects. Quote, "is a step backward compared with the explanations Marx and Engels gave in the 70s using the lesson of the Commune as an example. As far as the supposedly necessary, quote, bureaucratic organization is concerned, there is no difference whatever between a railway and any other enterprise in large-scale machine industry, any factor, large shop, or large-scale capitalist agricultural enterprise. The technique of all these enterprises makes absolutely imperative the strictest discipline, the utmost precision on the part of everyone in carrying out his allotted task, for otherwise the whole enterprise may come to a stop, or machinery or the finished product may be damaged. In all these enterprises, the workers will, of course, quote, elect delegates who will form a sort of parliament, end quote, bracket, that is, Soviets, end bracket, end quote. Lenin. As we can see, Lenin, when Lenin was a Marxist revolutionary, did not conceive of a proletarian state without workers' councils, without that, quote, association by means of which the proletarian administers production instead of the bourgeoisie, after the bourgeoisie is defeated. Following Marx and Engels, Lenin saw in these councils, quote, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economic emancipation of labor, end quote. And, quote, except on this condition, the communal constitution would have been an impossibility and a delusion, end quote. Marx. Stalin, Bukharin, and co., however, are devoted to hauling off to the dungeons of the GPU under the accusation of being counter-revolutionaries, all workers who have the audacity to talk about organizing these councils. And yet Stalin, Bukharin, and co. still dare to call themselves Marxist-Leninists, exclamation point. And the bureaucracy that administers production in the state, as well as the whole bureaucratic apparatus, they call that a worker state. Woe to anyone who would dare to deny it. We, the workers, who operate the productive apparatus that has been bequeathed to us by capitalism, and relying on our experience as workers, will institute a strict iron discipline by way of the state power of the armed workers, bracket, that is, the Soviets, end bracket. We shall reduce the role of public officials to that of mere executive agents of our directives, to the role of, quote, foremen and accountants, end quote, all of whom will be responsible to the rank and file, recallable at any time and modestly paid, preserving, of course, every type of specialist, of every variety and category. This is our proletarian task, and it is on this basis that we can and must begin the realization of the proletarian revolution. In the manifesto, Marx and Engels stated that, quote, the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy, end quote. And Lenin added that the starting point, after the victory of the proletarian revolution, is the transformation of the councils into the administrative organs of production and the foundation of the state. The leaders of the bureaucracy, Stalin, Bukharin, and co., drafted the program of the Comintern, which never once mentions that the proletariat as a class, organized into councils, can become the ruling class. But if the proletariat reminds them of their betrayal of Marxism, then comes repression, to the great joy of the gangster bureaucrats. That's the end of section 4, the proletarian revolution and the proletarian state. Section 5, private capitalism, state capitalism, and the proletariat. Lenin said that in contemporary capitalist society, the post office is organized like a state capitalist monopoly. If all the more important enterprises were to be converted, like the post office, into a state capitalist monopoly, and were to be managed by officials, directors, and managers, if this were to be accomplished, then we would have state capitalism. The really wealthy bourgeoisie has disappeared. Production is therefore administered by the bureaucracy, which has become the ruling class, rising from a subordinate position in bourgeois society to a position of dominance in this society. This means that state capitalism is the organization of the bureaucracy as a ruling class, the bureaucracy administering production and the state. The bureaucracy accedes to control over all the means of production and over the state, tasks precisely performed by the bourgeoisie. Previously performed by the bourgeoisie. Bourgeois rule is replaced by the rule of the bureaucracy, and just as the bourgeoisie succeeds in controlling the elections in a bourgeois state, the bureaucracy does the same thing in its state. In the bureaucratic state, the working class is still the class that is economically and politically reduced to slavery. Only now it is the bureaucracy rather than the bourgeoisie that exploits and uses it. Quote, a state that would play the role of a private entrepreneur would proceed in exactly the same way as a private capitalist and might even make a bigger profit. State capitalism is the worst form of capitalism because it is a concentration of both political and economic power and can oppress and exploit the workers more cruelly and intensely, end quote, declared Wilhelm Liebknecht in his speech at the Erfurt Congress, where the Erfurt program was approved. For the proletariat to be able to shed these latest parasites, the proletariat's new exploiters and oppressors, to get rid of the bureaucracy, the proletariat must become the ruling class. The proletariat must organize as a class in councils, and these councils must assume responsibility for all the functions exercised by the ruling bureaucratic class, the administration and direction of production and distribution, all the factories, workshops, domestically owned enterprises and foreign corporations, etc., must be directed by an elected organ of the councils, instead of the directors, managers, and their bureaucratic underlings. This would constitute the practical realization of what Lenin foresaw when Lenin spoke of, quote, reducing the role of state officials to that of simply carrying out our instructions, end quote, paid the, quote, wages of the average workman, end quote. This is our duty as proletarians, and this is the task to which we must devote our efforts after the proletarian revolution, according to Lenin. Only thus can the foundations of the social bureaucratic system be dismantled. The foundations of bureaucratic tyranny, exploitation, and slavery, and of the whole bureaucratic regime. Without this, all the talk about the struggle against bureaucracy is just so many empty words, disseminated in order to further the material and spiritual submission of the proletariat, to deceive the workers and the peasants. The Stalins, Bukharins, and co. say that the state that they administer is a worker state. They say this to fool the working class, so that the working class does not fight for a real worker state. The Stalins, Bukharins, and co. are defending their power and bureaucratic rule. But if this state, whose production and distribution are run by a bureaucracy, is a worker state, what shall we call the state in which the proletariat would really be the ruling class? That is, the class that administers production, distribution, and the state. A state in which the councils administer production and constitute the, quote, foundations of the proletarian state, end quote. In which the cooperatives administer exchange, performing the functions of the current state commercial agencies, of the People's Commissariat for Commerce, etc., and in which the trade unions have assumed responsibility for the tasks currently performed by the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate. What kind of state is that? Marx, Engels, and Lenin call this a worker state. But what do you say, honorable leaders of the bureaucracy, Stalin, Bukharin, and co.? If we ask this question, you are ready to eliminate us with your favorite method, the dungeons of the GPU. But repression will not prevent this question from being asked. The proletariat will ask it and will also answer it, against and in spite of you. And all the honest, brave, and lucid people will abandon you and will join the proletariat in its battle for victory. To annihilate the bureaucracy, it is necessary to 1. Organize the councils, give the councils control over production as organs of the state, also preserving the councils of peasant delegates and the urban neighborhood councils. Neighborhood and councils. 2. Transfer all capital, all rights and all duties of the People's Commissariat for Commerce and of the state trade agencies to the cooperatives, abolishing the former institutions. 3. Transfer to the trade unions the function of the state's bureaucratic control apparatus, normally exercised by the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate. Abolish all the councils of people's commissars, which have become carbon copies of the cabinets of the bourgeois states, and transfer all their powers and duties to the presidium of the Central Executive Committee, in which the corresponding departments will have to be organized. 5. Establish the Central Executive Committee as a permanent institution, rather than as a clique of play-acting part-time chatterboxes who meet only to ratify with the stroke of a pen whatever the bureaucracy does. 6. Liquidate the institution for the secret repression of the dissident workers, peasants, and intellectuals by drawing all legal functions from the GPU, withdrawing all legal functions from the GPU and offering every worker the rights to defend himself before a court of law and to a public trial. 7. Recognize the right of the workers, peasants, and intellectuals to freedom of expression, of assembly, of association, etc., at least to the same degree as prevails in the bourgeois democratic countries, Germany, France, England, United States, etc. 8. Declare an amnesty for all workers, peasants, and intellectuals who have been sentenced to prison terms or who have been deported for political reasons by the secret tribunals of the GPU. Is this the road that has been followed by the Stalins, the Bukharins, and co.? What such a program would mean is nothing less than the death of the bureaucracy and the bureaucracy's rule. The bureaucracy will oppose the creation of a worker state with as much determination as the bourgeoisie of any capitalist country. Why would the bourgeoisie want the workers to organize into councils and transform the councils into the administrative institutions of their countries? Why would the bureaucracy want the cooperatives to take over commerce and administer foreign and domestic trade? Why would the bourgeoisie want the trade unions to take charge of the functions that are now performed by government ministers? They would fight against this with tooth and nail and with every means at their disposal. And how will the bureaucracy defend itself? Can the bureaucracy possibly eliminate every proletarian inclined to engage in peaceful struggle and to try to share his convictions about the workers' state, and thus act in a much more draconian way than the bourgeoisie of Germany, England, France, and the United States? Or maybe the proletariat enjoys, even if minimally, some formal rights and liberties, the freedom of expression, of the press, of assembly, of association, as in the above-mentioned countries. The bureaucracy claims that the proletariat possesses very few rights and liberties in the capitalist countries where the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie reigns. The dictatorship of the bourgeoisie reigns. True enough, but the bureaucracy concedes exactly the same paltry rights and liberties to the workers, peasants, and intellectuals as the bourgeois states. The bourgeoisie grants the proletariat the right to freedom of expression, of the press, of assembly, of association, etc., But since all the means of production, including the presses and the paper factories, buildings, transport, and means of communication, are in the hands of the bourgeoisie, the proletariat must proceed by scraping together its pennies from its miserable wage in order to obtain the means that would allow it to publish the newspapers, magazines, and books that it needs, and to rent and operate the buildings for its committees, rallies, and so on. In this case, the liberties and the rights of the proletariat are perfectly determined by its economic slavery. In state capitalist countries, all the means of production that previously belonged to the bourgeoisie are now under the control of the bureaucracy. This is the principal difference between state capitalism and private capitalism. In Russia, the bureaucracy controls all the means of production, just as the bourgeoisie does in the capitalist countries. But in addition to this economic servitude, it also deprives the proletariat of its formal rights and liberties, the freedom of expression, of the press, of assembly, of association, even in the framework of the narrow limits authorized by a bourgeois dictatorship. In this case, although the workers must sweat blood for their miserable wages, they cannot publish any newspapers, magazines, or books, parenthesis, of a non-bureaucratic nature, in parenthesis, nor can they organize in a party, parenthesis, except in the bureaucratic party, in parenthesis, in order to fight to free themselves from the bureaucratic yoke and for a workers' state. A workers' state, besides the fact that a workers' state would guarantee the legal and formal recognition of rights and liberties for all the workers, would also guarantee that it would be materially possible to exercise these rights and these liberties, allowing the working class population access to presses, buildings, transportation, and the means of communication which are under the control of the councils. It is in the interest of the proletariat as a class that there should be various parties so that the proletarians would thus have the opportunity of choosing from among the diverse programs and political positions of these parties, and so that none of them should seize exclusive power and be transformed from a servant of the proletariat into a master and oppressor, and from a champion of rights and liberties into a tyrant that abolishes them. When the bureaucracy loudly proclaims in its appeals to the proletariat of the capitalist countries that it should fight and overthrow the bourgeoisie, then the proletariat of all those countries should ask themselves, who will the bureaucracy put in charge of production? The proletariat organized into councils, or the bureaucratic enterprise directors, bosses, and managers? Who will the bureaucracy put in charge of the state? The production syndicates, parenthesis, the trade unions, and parenthesis, or a bureaucracy called the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate? Will the proletariat have at least the same rights and freedom of expression, of the press, of assembly, and of association as in the societies of private capitalism under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie? What is the proletariat fighting for? For state capitalism, for a bureaucratic state, or for a workers' state? Before going into battle, the proletariat of all countries must know that the proletariat of all countries is fighting to liberate itself once and for all from exploitation and slavery. The old Marxist standard, the Manifesto, which proclaims that the task of the proletarian revolution is to, quote, raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class to win the battle of democracy, end quote, is the standard of the proletarian struggle against private capitalism, against the bourgeoisie, and against the bureaucracy. The proletarians of all countries will unite and will emerge victorious from this battle. That's the end of Section 5, Private Capitalism, State Capitalism, and the Proletariat. Hey everybody. I don't know why I'm saying hey everybody. This is all going to be one video. I'm just recording the videos separately. But this is Section 6, the Program of Bureaucratic Mystification. The bureaucracy, led by Stalin and Bukharin, announces that its power is the power of the bureaucracy and the bureaucracy's party, and that this consists in the dictatorship of the proletariat in alliance with the peasantry, Anyone who dares to audibly express doubts about this will be invited to visit the dungeons of the GPU, where he will be able to experience for himself the warm, quote, camaraderie of the bureaucrats. The bureaucracy is augmenting its power and its rule and is savagely eliminating all the workers who dare to raise their voices against its omnipotence and in favor of a workers' state. This whole program of, quote, self-criticism, the, quote, limits set by the bureaucracy to its, quote, self-criticism, are the limits of the defense and the reinforcement of bureaucratic rule, which accompany the one-party dictatorship and are inherent in the rule of the bureaucracy. In its message, quote, to all the members of the party, to all workers, end quote, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, after the usual introductory boilerplate, explains the practical measures that it seeks to implement with respect to the Soviet apparatus. 1. Quote, the struggle against bureaucratism and therefore a bold streamlining of its apparatus, end quote. Neither more nor less. These audacious initiatives are terribly shocking. They plan to eliminate themselves, but let us examine the ways they have in mind for combating bureaucratism. 2. Quote, the promotion of workers to positions in the state and the economic apparatus of the state. This promotion will have to be compulsory, systematic, immediate, and carried out on a daily basis, end quote. What? It is a revolution. Quote, the promotion of workers to positions in the state and the economic apparatus of the state, end quote. Nothing could be more simple. We shall allow the workers to organize themselves in councils and transform them into organizations that will control the economy and production, while they also become the, quote, foundation of state power, end quote. All of this coincides with Marx and Engels and with the program of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks, parenthesis, although not with that of the Comintern, since this demand, which is the very essence of the program of the proletarian revolution, has been totally abolished, in parenthesis. In this way, the proletariat organized in councils, integrally, day after day, systematically and without any restrictions, will participate in all the affairs of the state and the state's economic tasks, from the most trivial to the most important. And this means the disappearance of all the bureaucrats, of bureaucratism and of the rule of the bureaucracy over the workers, since it would mean the power of the workers over the bureaucrats. And in order to put an end to bureaucratism once and for all, it is necessary to evict from the sphere of exchange all the commercial commissars and state agents who come from the ranks of the bureaucrats, and hand over all the capital, the organizations, the rights and responsibilities of these state bodies to the cooperatives, which is what the bureaucracy has been so insistently proclaiming every day in the newspapers. And in order to cause the bureaucracy, which for the purposes of deceiving the workers and peasants has created the Workers and Peasants Inspectorate, to disappear totally from the sphere of state control, all the tasks previously carried out by the WPI, Workers and Peasants Inspectorate, must be transferred to the trade unions, to all the proletarian organizations as one man in their organizations, which are the trade unions. Then we shall see what workers' control really is. Not so fast, implores the bureaucrat. How can you transform the integral organization of the proletariat, the councils, into a state organization? This is unprecedented. Even Kautsky said that it was impossible. But let us see just what it is that Kautsky himself says, quote, the Soviets of 1905 were local organizations confined to single towns. Those of 1917 were not only more numerous but closely knit together. Single Soviets were affiliated to a greater body, which in its turn was part of an organization comprehending the whole empire, its organization being the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, and a permanent central executive committee, end quote. Kautsky. Kautsky continues, quote, already the Soviet organization can look back on a great and glorious history. A more important period lies before it, and not in Russia alone, end quote. And Kautsky concludes, quote, the Soviet organization is, therefore, one of the most important phenomena of our time. The Soviet organization promises to acquire an outstanding significance in the great decisive struggles between capital and labor which are before us. Can we ask even more than this of the Soviets? The Bolsheviks, who together with the left-wing social revolutionaries obtained a majority in the Russian workers' councils after the November Revolution of 1917, after the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, proceeded to make an organ of government of the Soviets, which hitherto had been the fighting organization of a class. End quote. Kautsky. What councils is Kautsky talking about? The Rural Soviet of peasant delegates? No, he is talking about the councils, the integral organizations that include, as if it were one man, the wage workers of all the enterprises. Quote, marvelous. Form up in Soviets, you proletarians and poor peasants. But for God's sake, don't you dare win. Don't even think of winning. The moment you win and vanquish the bourgeoisie, that will be the end of you, for you must not be, quote, state organizations in a proletarian sense. In fact, as soon as you have won, you must break up, exclamation point, end quote. And I'm not sure it sounds like kind of like sarcastic, so I don't know if that's Lenin or Kautsky or what. Quote, what a marvelous Marxist this man Kautsky is. What an inimitable, quote, theoretician of renegacy, end quote. Lenin says, parenthesis, see the proletarian revolution in the renegade Kautsky. This, quote, inimitable, quote, theoretician of renegacy, end quote, is opposed to the transformation of the councils into the direct organs of production and the, quote, foundation of the state, end quote. Kautsky requests that they dissolve themselves, but what about the bureaucracy? What do the Stalins and Bukharins have to say? They agree. They also demand that the councils must dissolve. If Kautsky is the, quote, inimitable, quote, theoretician of renegacy, end quote, what are our Stalins and Bukharins? According to Marx and Engels, the councils are, quote, the political form at last discovered, bracket, without which, end bracket, the communal constitution would have been an impossibility and a delusion, end quote. Just who are Stalin and Bukharin the disciples of, with regard to this central question of the proletarian revolution, concerning the theme of the proletarian state, the question of knowing the form by which the proletariat organizes as the ruling class? Are they Kautskyists or Marxists? The bureaucracy not only opposes the transformation of the councils into the directive organs of production and the organization of the state, but also attacks with an animal ferocity and an implacable savagery any proletarian who dares to speak of creating workers' councils. We have already explained what kind of, quote, workerism, end quote, it is that they want in the state apparatus, the same kind as the bourgeoisie, for the bourgeoisie also recruits its high functionaries and the bourgeoisie's cadres from among the workers, which helps the bourgeoisie to more effectively maintain the bourgeoisie's rule over the proletariat. The bureaucracy does exactly the same thing and constantly appeals to the working class origins of certain bureaucrats. But that is a lie. It is calumny. Miserable insinuations and slanders against our, quote, cohorts and our, quote, old guard, who defend the assemblies of production. Listen to this, for example, quote, take an active part in the production assemblies, ensure that the practical proposals of the workers are implemented as thoroughly as possible, end quote. That is really what is supposed to happen, exclamation point. But let us cast a glance back in time and acquaint ourselves with a little history. When were the production assemblies legalized? After the campaign led by the workers' group of the Communist Party Soviet Union in 1923, in order to prevent the formation of workers' councils, which the workers' group was calling for with the support of the workers, it was alleged that such a project posed too many difficulties, and the bureaucracy decided to replace them with quote, production assemblies, end quote. These assemblies were created solely for the purpose of serving as tools of the bureaucracy to hoodwink the proletarians and to disorganize their struggle for the formation of real workers' councils. These workers' assemblies have no rights. They are nothing but a useless appendage of the omnipotent bureaucracy. Excuse me. Shut a burpsy. Where the hell am I? The directors, the foremen, the managers of the enterprise, etc., and they enjoy practically the same prerogatives of the Bulletin Duma. Footnote: Alexander Bulygin lived from 1851 to 1919, was the Russian Minister of the Interior between February and October 1905. In response to the Revolution of 1905, he promulgated a constitution at a Duma that was subsequently referred to as the Bulygin Duma. End footnote. Moreover, Bukharin has let the cat out of the bag with respect to these, quote, production assemblies, end quote. It would seem that in the United States, the bourgeoisie has also established production assemblies. There's only a slight difference between our assemblies and those in the United States. That is, in the United States, 85% of the Assembly's proposals are approved, while here only 35 to 40% are authorized. Parentheses, see Bukharin's speech at the Fifth Congress. This is the only difference. On the other hand, just as in the United States, the assemblies of production not only do not weaken the power of the bourgeoisie, but lower the cost of exploitation. Here not only do they not weaken the power of the bureaucracy, but they reduce the cost of the rule over the working class. For it is the bureaucracy and no one else that benefits from the counsels and the experience of the workers to improve the production process, and it is the bureaucracy that uses this apparent proletarian participation in order to direct production and to keep the workers compliant and submissive. What the American bourgeoisie fears and will always will fear is the prospect of these assemblies being transformed into councils that would seize control of production in the state. This is anathema to the American bourgeoisie and always will be. Why? Because this would amount to its social extinction, the death sentence for the bourgeoisie. So is it true that our bureaucrats want us, the workers, to transform these production assemblies into councils and take over production in the state? Of course not. They are disseminating all this confusion, these malevolent lies and slanders, in order to frighten and disorient the proletariat. But the proletariat nonetheless continues to demand the creation of councils. In the face of all the forces of the GPU, the bureaucracy will not hesitate to launch a bloody repression against the workers to defend the bureaucracy's state. But even if the bureaucracy does, the proletariat will not desist from its efforts and will win in the end. Why does the bureaucracy want to prevent these production assemblies from being transformed into councils? For the same reason as the American bourgeoisie, because this would mean its social extinction and its social death. Besides these production assemblies, however, there are also the control commissions. The Central Committee of the Communist Party Soviet Union Bolsheviks decrees, quote, extend the control commissions to all sectors of production and transport, end quote. Once again, let us cast a glance back in time and review a little history. The control commissions were formed in 1925 to respond to a slogan of the workers' groups, quote, trade union control, end quote, a slogan that reflected the demand to transfer all functions of the workers and peasants inspectorate to the trade unions. In order to divert the attention of the workers from this slogan, in order to deceive the workers without conceding the workers any rights, the bureaucracy created the Provisional Control Commission, which had the same rights as the production assemblies, that is, none at all, and of course it opposed with all its powers and all means at its disposal any transfer of the rights and responsibilities of the Rabkrim, bracket, the Workers and Peasants Inspectorate, in bracket, to the trade unions. Tomsky, Dagadov, and co. played on this occasion the same role that the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries played in the councils of workers and soldiers prior to October 1917, rejecting the transfer of power to the councils and dissuading the proletariat from pursuing such a course of action. The difference between them lies in the fact that Skobelev Chikidze and co. refused to yield power to the councils in order to help the bourgeoisie, while Tomsky, Dogodov and co. refused to do so in order to support the bureaucracy. Tomsky, Dogodov, and the other trade union bureaucrats deceitfully encouraged the workers not to transfer state power to the hands of their general organizations, the trade unions, but to hand over this power to the bureaucracy in the form of the Robkrin, which is again the Workers and Peasants Inspectorate. Even more passionately, the trade union bureaucracy insisted that the workers must not organize themselves in councils and transform the councils into organs of the state and directive organs over production. The trade union bureaucracy used every means at their disposal: pressure, bribery, calumny, secret repression on the part of the GPU, and all of it was dissimulated behind a torrent of vapid speeches about the workers' state, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and proletarian democracy. That is how they fought the bureaucratization of the state apparatus and, quote, rejuvenated the trade unions. Now let us see how they, quote, rejuvenated the party. Everyone knows that once a year, or sometimes a little more frequently, they devote themselves to the task of encouraging the work of the Soviets, the trade unions, the cooperatives, and the party. We find nothing particularly, quote, self-critical about this type of, quote, cheerleading, which is so fashionable. It's just the same old bureaucratic fakery to which we have all become accustomed, and with whose value we are so well acquainted. We have already seen how the bureaucracy rejuvenates the work of the Soviets and the trade unions. This, quote, rejuvenation also has other aspects, but since they are nothing new, we may omit examining them. This is how the bureaucracy decided to rejuvenate the party. 1, quote, guarantee complete liberty of internal criticism, end quote. And 2, quote, ensure the election of responsible party members, end quote. If we take the trouble to examine the decrees on the structure and the life of the party since 1921, we will not find a single decree in which internal party democracy, freedom of criticism, election of responsible members, etc. are not mentioned. And we always find the same old song, quote, rejuvenate, thanks to, quote, freedom of criticism, and by way of the, quote, election of all responsible party members, end quote. Why? Because the bureaucracy, by the bureaucracy's very nature, is incapable of basing the living party on proletarian democracy. To ask the bureaucracy to rejuvenate its own party on the basis of proletarian democracy is to ask the bureaucracy to do the impossible. Our task consists in revealing all the lies that are concealed behind these words and these Marxist speeches devoted to fooling the proletariat and peasantry. In an attempt to legitimize its rule, the bureaucracy is attempting to cause its state form to be perceived as a workers' state, a perfect state. In this respect, it is acting no differently than all previous ruling classes who justify their rule as the, quote, kingdom of God on earth, end quote, an absolute ideal that could not be more perfect. The bureaucracy has to justify this dogma, which is why it formulates the theory that the proletariat is incapable of establishing its dictatorship with its own organizations, the workers' councils, and therefore must establish it by way of the bureaucracy and the bureaucracy's party. This is how the original notion of the dictatorship of a class was resolved into the power of a single party that does not permit the existence of any other parties. This nefarious theory is ridiculous. We all know that the capitalist states have various parties besides the one that controls the government. Furthermore, in all the bourgeois states, various parties can share power and govern at the same time by forming a coalition government, the Left Coalition in France, the Müller government in Germany, Branting in Sweden, etc. Pravda itself has announced that in the elections to the German Reichstag, 30 parties participated, 10 parties competed in the elections to the Chamber of Deputies in France, etc., including the communist parties, whose goal is the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie. Does this mean, however, that these countries are not ruled by dictatorships? Not at all.
if there is a state, then democracy and dictatorship also exist, side by side. These are characteristics inherent to every state. Parenthesis, see the illegal pamphlet by Borisov titled On the Workers' State, in parenthesis. The multi-party form of bourgeois rule does not rule out the existence of a dictatorship, just as one-party rule in the petty bourgeois bureaucratic Russian state does not rule out the fact that the ruling class, the bureaucracy, enjoys the benefits of democracy. One-party rule is not the only patrimony of the bureaucracy. One-party rule also existed under the rule of the nobility, the feudal lords, in the Middle Ages. At that time, the dictatorship of a class, the nobility, was the dictatorship of a party, just as today the dictatorship and the power of the party in Russia is the dictatorship of the bureaucracy. We may even say the old system of clans and tribal elites, which was replaced by the slave-holding republics of Athens and Rome, was also a system of one-party rule. Human history has experienced two forms, two systems of rule, one-party rule and multi-party rule. In both systems, however, we can find dictatorship and democracy at the same time. Currently in Russia, we have one party, and the dictatorship of one party is the equivalent to the dictatorship of one class, the bureaucracy, which is the master of production, distribution in the state, and which concentrates in its hands economic and political power at the same time. The bureaucracy preaches to the proletariat that its rule is a worker state. Here it is guided purely by its egoistic class interest, seeking to fool the proletariat and subject the proletariat to the bureaucracy's spiritual influence in order to thus fortify and defend the bureaucracy's rule. By defending the bureaucracy's rule and the bureaucracy's state by means of one-party rule, the bureaucracy does not want to and cannot allow any criticism of the bureaucracy's policies, which might serve as the basis for a program for another party, even if this criticism takes the form of the most peaceful, the most moderate, and most temperate propaganda, such as the criticism of the autocracy of the Octoberists, or for the most, quote, moderate and, quote, fair program advocated by some people, parentheses, such as Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, in parentheses. Its supporters cannot be allowed to organize and transform their criticism into an organized criticism. Criticism leveled by a group, parentheses, quote, the counter-revolutionary mob, end quote, end parentheses, or a party or an organization, a consistent and everyday criticism that fights day after day to influence the proletarian masses, the peasantry and the intelligentsia, in electoral campaigns for the leadership of the trade unions, the cooperatives, the institutions of public security, the workers' councils, etc., a criticism that would enter into conflict everywhere with the ruling party and would present its own programs and its own candidates. If the bureaucracy were to allow this, the bureaucracy would have to expend more efforts to defend its rule. The bureaucracy will therefore not make this concession unless it is forced to do so. But even if it is forced to concede such liberties, however, it will not want to abandon its dictatorship. To do so would be the beginning of the end, for then the proletariat would rapidly come to understand that it is necessary to organize councils and transform those councils into the directive organs of production and organs of the state, to transfer to the cooperatives all the functions of the state institutions of commerce and the people's commissariats for commerce, and to transfer all the rights and responsibilities of the Rabkrin to the trade unions, the Workers and Soldiers Inspectorate, or whatever it's called, the Workers and Peasants Inspectorate, to the trade unions. This would put an end to the hopes of the bureaucrats to retain their hold on power, violence, and dictatorship. All of this means that, remaining faithful to its class interests, the bureaucracy will not tolerate any organized criticism. The only kind of criticism to which the proletariat aspires, or any criticism of its political line, the line of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party Soviet Union Bolsheviks, the line of its party and its committees. But if the bureaucracy will not tolerate any, quote, critical program, a criticism that would propose its own point of view, with its own base and its own program, this means that it will tolerate absolutely no criticism at all, since criticism without a basis, without a point of view of its own program, without a point of view or its own program,
is no criticism at all, and if criticism of that kind is expressed, it will be nothing but hollow phrases, wishful thinking, a fake, quote, criticism expressed by fake people. Even the most tyrannical states allow this kind of criticism, where there is no freedom to form parties, freedom of association, there is not, nor can there be, any freedom of criticism. We learned this elementary lesson during the time of the illegal, quote, circles of 1906, but now they are trying to make us forget it, and they are sparing no efforts in their attempt to make the proletariat forget it too. The bureaucratic dictatorship is totally guaranteed by the one-party system. Since there is only one party, that of the bureaucracy, it will therefore stop at nothing to prevent the creation of other legal parties. In other words, the bureaucracy will not tolerate, nor will the bureaucracy permit, any criticism of the political line. All criticism of the party's policy will be considered to be counter-revolutionary and Menshevik, and anyone who expresses the least degree of disagreement, heresy, or disbelief will be threatened with the most draconian punishments. And if this is not enough, the GPU will come to its aid with all its very special methods in order to persuade the proletarians, peasants, and intellectuals that the speeches of the Central Committee of the Communist Party Soviet Union are the truth. Would the bureaucracy be faithful to the bureaucracy's interest if the bureaucracy were to allow criticism within the party? Of course not. Internal criticism of the party is first and foremost criticism of the policy of the committees, including the Central Committee. By criticizing its policy and proposing a different policy inevitably leads to posing the question of the formation of groups and fractions. The fraction is potentially, as a dormant possibility, another party, and those who prohibit the existence of other parties cannot allow the existence of groups or factions within their party. Therefore, those who prohibit criticism outside of the party cannot allow criticism within the party either. That is why they have eliminated all internal opposition, regardless of its political line, by availing themselves of the methods of the GPU. And after each wave of repression, when the bureaucracy announces that for the 1000th time that its desire is to, quote, guarantee freedom of criticism within the party, end quote, the conscious proletarians will understand that this is nothing but bureaucratic sophistry to fool the proletariat and the peasantry. That's the end of Section 6, the program of bureaucratic mystification. Section 7. Proletarian democracy is the tomb of the bureaucracy. During the early years of Bolshevism, in July 1904, a conference was held that was attended by 22 Bolsheviks. At this conference, the following resolution was approved, quote, the rules to provide guarantees that party struggles are conducted by party methods, end quote. Quote, that this reform is essential is shown by the entire experience of the post-Congress struggle. It is necessary to include in the party rules guarantees of the rights of any minority so that disagreements, dissatisfactions, and irritations that will constantly and unavoidably arise may be diverted from the old Philistine circle channels of rows and squabbling into the still unaccustomed channels of a constitutional and dignified struggle for one's convictions. Among the conditions needed for such a change, we see the following. The minority should be allowed one or more writers' groups with the right to be represented at Congress. The widest formal guarantees should be given as regards publication of party literature, criticizing the activities of the central party institutions. The right of the committees to receive, through the general party transport system, the particular party publications they desire should be formally recognized. The limits of the Central Committee's right to influence the personal composition of the committees should be precisely defined, end quote. Compilation of the resolutions of the Congresses and Conferences of the Communist Party Soviet Union Bolsheviks Sorry, that was a citation. Citation: compilation of the resolutions of the congresses and conferences of the Communist Party, Soviet Union Bolsheviks, 1898 to 1926. And what does this document tell you, esteemed bureaucrats? Hello? Are you there? Stalin? Bukharin? Do not try to hide from us behind the GPU. Just tell us what you think of this resolution of the Bolsheviks. Does it not grant rights to the minority or to the minority groups to engage in the battle of ideas against the majority, so that the minorities can criticize the actions of the majority, the theory and the practice of the superior institutions of the party, and even at the congresses? Where exactly does it say that groups and militants are prohibited from criticizing the superior committees? What exactly was the intention of the Bolsheviks? Tell us, infallible leaders of the party! ! That's right. The Bolsheviks were not afraid of criticism or of counter-criticism or their consequences. Down with all icons. There is no prohibition of criticism in the congresses, conferences, local or central committees. To the contrary, the Bolsheviks had the courage to protect the exercise of a comprehensive right of minorities to publish texts directed against the party's institutions, and thus sought to fortify the struggle, to keep it free and clear of all charlatanry, all gossip and all scandals, to situate it at the level that is in conformance with a struggle of convictions. What does Bolshevism have in common with the stupid conduct of Sub-Commandant Prichibayev and of Stalin, Bukharin, and co.? Footnote: a character in a novel by Anton Chekhov, a voluntary informer and incompetent administrator, a symbol of the power of the Tsarist autocracy in Russia. End footnote. We must ask ourselves what happened to those guarantees that were proposed for insertion into the party constitution to which those 22 Bolsheviks referred. At the next Congress, the statutes were revised, and, quote, guarantees for the rights of minorities, end quote, were introduced. Quote, the Central Committee must convoke a Congress within the next 2 months if the organization of the party requests it to do so, and if these organizations obtain the support of at least half the votes of the Congress delegates. If the Central Committee refuses to convoke this Congress at the request of half of the committees, a conference of representatives of the committees with the right to vote will have the option of electing an organizational committee that will convoke the Congress. This organizational committee will have the same rights as the Central Committee. End quote. Thus, the minority groups would have the guarantee that if their criticisms of the superior institutions of the party gain the support of half of the party members, parenthesis, this proportion was later reduced to 1/3, end parenthesis, they would have the right to convoke an extraordinary Congress, and if the Central Committee refuses to authorize such a Congress, these groups would have the right to form an organizational committee, and without the authorization and in direct defiance of the Central Committee, it would itself have the right to convoke the Congress. These were the statutory guarantees and rights of minorities, and these guarantees and rights were enforced right up until 1921. Between 1905 and 1917, this Bolshevik patience passed through the crucible of 3 revolutions. The internal structure of the party was strictly bound to the living forces of the revolution, and this led to the greatest and most glorious victories that the world has ever seen. What does this Bolshevism have in common with the grotesque parody enacted by Stalin, Bukharin, and co.? After the coup d'etat, for which the foundations were laid by the change in the correlation of forces between the classes between 1917 and 1920, which favored the petty bourgeoisie, the proletariat was overthrown from its dominant position and was replaced by the bureaucracy, a situation that was formally recognized during the 9th Congress of the Communist Party, Soviet Union, which permitted the abandonment of the elective and collegial principles in the administration of industry and introduced the appointment system of one-man management. It was after the successful execution of the coup d'etat, answering to the aspirations of the bureaucracy for one-party dictatorship, at the 10th Congress, when a motion was introduced no longer seeking to guarantee the rights of minorities, no longer for the purpose of guaranteeing the rights of one or more groups to criticize the theory and practice of the superior institutions of the party, but instead to prohibit the organization of groups or fractions. This motion was presented amidst a flood of vacuous words about workers' democracy in the party, about the right of all party members to engage in criticism, etc., and so forth. You may engage in criticism, comrades, but not collectively, not in groups. You may criticize, but without a program, without any reference points, and without a platform. But this means precisely to deprive the party militants of all rights to criticism, while they are allowed the right to gossip, to say foolish things, to engage in intrigue and calumny. And since then, every year, and sometimes twice a year, motions are proposed concerning internal party democracy, freedom of criticism, and the absence of elections. But it is only by returning to the revolutionary traditions of revolutionary Marxism, Bolshevism, which regulated the life of the party from its inception up until 1921, that proletarian democracy can be restored to the party. To accomplish this, however, a proletarian party is not necessary, not a bureaucratic party. Quote, that which was born to crawl cannot fly, end quote. Let us now examine the question of elections. An election takes place when there is a choice to make. If you go into a store and they only have one brand of cigarettes, you do not have a choice. When there is only one way of viewing the world, one program, a single political line, and it is prohibited to suggest any other, one has no choice but to choose the program, that political system, and that way of life. Whether or not one votes, whether one elects Tom, Dick, or Harry, or anyone else, the political line, the system, and the program will not change. Such elections are without interest and constitute a truly bureaucratic and empty formality, by means of which the bureaucracy is granted the formal right to exercise the bureaucracy's dictatorship and to rule in exactly the same way as before. That is exactly what it means when they talk about, quote, electing all the officials of the party, end quote. And the same is true of the elections in the trade unions, cooperatives, and the workers' councils and other institutions. When the only party, the party of the bureaucracy, participates in elections, it will win a majority, whether or not it wins the majority of the votes. And if some honest non-party individuals are also elected, it is only because the bureaucracy needs those non-party individuals to back up its demagogy. Quote, of course they were free elections. Even people who are not members of the party were elected, end quote. It will loudly proclaim. In actuality, however, no segment of the population, not the proletariat, not the peasantry, not the intelligentsia, has the right to participate in an organized manner in these elections, whether as a group or as a party, with a program or a tactic that would be opposed to the party of the bureaucrats. It is not possible to have any influence in elections. It is not possible to have any influence in elections unless you are organized. What would the bureaucracy have to say about elections to the Reichstag if the only party that had the right to participate in the elections was the racist party? What would the bureaucracy say about the majority of the vote that it would surely obtain? And if in Germany there were a state capitalist system, if the bourgeoisie had been annihilated, if all the medium-sized and large enterprises had been placed under the control of the state, managed by directors, foremen, etc., appointed by the party, and if the Teutons, the German fascists, were to have concentrated into their hands all the resources of industry, commerce, transport, the means of communication, the press, buildings, etc., and everything else, if year after year every election to state institutions was won by Teutonic candidates, except for a handful of non-party persons, honest persons, then what would the bureaucrats say? How would they characterize the German system? A worker state and proletarian democracy? The Teutons would say that it is socialism and that they are advancing towards communism. What is really happening, however, is that the proletariat elects one or another member of the ruling class to represent and depress it, lending legitimacy and prestige to the all-powerful bureaucracy. Many comrades have been so completely immobilized by the bureaucracy's, quote, theory, according to which the class dictatorship is one-party rule and that all other parties must be excluded, that they have become incapable of recovering a Marxist position on these questions. They say, quote, I agree, we do not have a worker state but a bureaucratic state, but it will be a worker state when we act totally in accordance with Marx. The Soviets will assume responsibility for production, the cooperatives will administer commerce, the trade unions will undertake the tasks of the workers and peasants inspectorate as the urban Soviets. And the Soviets, besides administering production, will begin to govern the country, the state, both the Soviets of peasant delegates as well as the urban Soviets. Who will lead the proletariat? The party? Yes, the party. And this means that the dictatorship of the proletariat will once again become the dictatorship of the party! Exclamation point. End quote. This is completely nonsense. The proletarian state cannot exist without various political parties, so that at one time, then another, then a third, and all the others, when their time comes, will direct the state at any given moment. And this does not at all mean that once one of these parties has taken power, it must deprive the population, including the proletariat, of the right to form parties, freedom of association, To the contrary, the peasants, who in bourgeois society had the right to form parties, that is, the peasants had freedom of expression and of the press, will not lose these rights and freedoms in a proletarian state. If we are to claim the support of the peasants, how can we deprive the peasants of what the peasants had already enjoyed in bourgeois society? If all the speeches about the alliance or the united front between the proletariat and the peasantry are supposed to be more than just empty words and lies, then we have to build this alliance on the basis of the common interests of the proletariat and the peasantry. And it is clear that the peasantry has an interest, a vital interest, in preserving its rights and liberties, including its freedom of association, at least at the same level that its counterparts enjoy in bourgeois states. Maybe it will have its own party, or maybe it will have several. The task of the proletariat is not to deprive the peasantry of its rights and liberties, but to ensure that it has access to the material conditions that will allow the peasantry to exercise these rights and liberties: printing presses, paper, transport, means of communication, office space, with the same opportunities as the workers' parties. Furthermore, a workers' party, if that workers' party really is a workers' party, cannot set that workers' party's self the goal of depriving the proletariat of the proletariat's rights and liberties. To the contrary, if a workers' party, it is a workers' party precisely because it fights for the rights and liberties of the proletariat. A party that, for whatever reason, takes away from the proletariat its rights and liberties ceases to be a workers' party. When the proletariat unleashes its struggle against the bourgeois state, a difficult struggle that demands numerous sacrifices, it does not do so because it wants to deprive itself of the rights and liberties which it enjoyed under a bourgeois state, freedom of expression of the press, etc. To the contrary, it fights to obtain new rights and liberties, to surpass the narrow constraints of the rights and liberties of the old bourgeois society and considerably augment them on its own account. Along with the legal recognition of the rights and liberties conceded by the bourgeois state, freedom of expression of the press, etc., the proletarian state will reinforce these rights with material means, supplying all the parties with presses, paper, office space, transport, and means of communication. This is what distinguishes proletarian democracy from bourgeois or bureaucratic democracy. In addition, the multi-party form of government would serve as a bulwark against the seizure of power by one party, and also against any party that, having taken power, changes from servant of the people to their master, exploiter, and oppressor. Wait a second. Sorry about this, I know it's annoying. Okay. But it is not possible for these proletarian liberties to be used as weapons to But is it not possible for these proletarian liberties to be used as weapons to overthrow the proletariat? No, for this reason. First, the worker state is the most progressive form of state that has ever existed, the most complete guarantee of the interest of all the workers and of humanity as a whole, offering an unprecedented field of action for the development of the productive forces. This means that the danger does not come from the classes that represent the future, but from those that belong to the past. In England, for example, where the proletarians constitute 90% of the population and the bourgeoisie 5%, the proletariat is exploited and oppressed by that 5%. There are various parties, among them the Communist Party, whose goal is the armed defeat of the bourgeoisie. There are also anarchists and syndicalists who share this goal. These parties are legal. Together with these revolutionary parties, there are also right-wing parties, bourgeois parties, a conservative party, a liberal party, a labor party, and an independent labor party. And why is the bourgeoisie so powerful? Because all the material means are in the bourgeoisie's hands, and by way of its economic rule it succeeds in subjecting the proletariat spiritually and politically. Of the 90% of the population that is proletarian, only 5% vote for the Communist Party. Let us imagine a different scenario. The proletariat has become the ruling class in England. It possesses all the material means of production and has consolidated its rule in the state. Henceforth, the Soviets administer production and the political affairs of the country. The cooperatives are in charge of distribution, and the trade unions exercise supervisory control over the state. If the bourgeoisie, who represents 5% of the population, and who previously controlled all the means of production, distribution, transport, etc., which are now controlled by the proletariat, had for centuries upheld its rule without needing to formally abolish the proletarian organizations, then the proletariat, which represents 90% of the population and now possesses all that previously belonged to the bourgeoisie, will certainly not need to abolish the organizations of the bourgeoisie. The legal existence of the bourgeois parties in a proletarian state would be much less dangerous for the proletariat than the existence of proletarian parties would be for the bourgeoisie in a bourgeois state. That is how the problem must be posed. Although this scenario is obviously situated after the Civil War, when the exploiters have been defeated, and if certain considerations of a military or political character make it necessary to suspend these rights and liberties, freedom of expression of the press, etc., and to place restrictions on everything else that can help or be used by the enemies of the proletariat, who orchestrate the armed struggle against the proletariat, then it will have to do so with a firm hand and without any hesitation. Thus, the multi-party form of rule completely guarantees the interests of the proletariat, the peasantry and the intelligentsia, and of all the workers, paving the way to a considerable development of the productive forces of the worker state, transforming society into an immense corporation, an immense factory, transforming society into a free, quote, association of producers, in which the happiness of the individual is inseparable from the happiness of all, end quote. A society that leads to communism, to the disappearance of the state, from the dictatorship, from democracy, from the political parties. If 30 parties running candidates for parliament do not constitute a threat to the bourgeoisie, then the proletariat certainly will not be endangered by the fact that the elections to the councils, the rural and urban Soviets, the leading committees of the cooperatives, the trade unions, etc., are contested by 300 parties. The bureaucracy opposes all criticism, but would change its universal rule. The bureaucracy opposes all criticism that would challenge the bureaucracy's universal rule, all criticism that would represent an attempt to raise the proletariat to the status of ruling class, all criticism that would go beyond minor sniping and personal attacks against such as the Artyomovists and the Smolenskists, etc., and would challenge the general line of the bureaucracy led by the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party Soviet Union Bolsheviks, which set the stage for this tedious campaign after the affairs of Artyomovsk and Smolensk. The bureaucracy strikes back against any criticism whose purpose is to put an end to its dictatorship and its all-encompassing power. The bureaucracy will fight such criticism with all the means at its disposal: secret repression, prison, calumny, provocation, and lies, dissimulating its repression under a copious verbiage concerning the, quote, freedom of criticism and, quote, self-criticism. All this blah, blah, blah about, quote, self-criticism and, quote, freedom of criticism is one of the methods that the bureaucracy uses to fool the proletariat and the peasantry and to reinforce its bureaucratic rule, quote, freedom of criticism and, quote, self-criticism. Litter the Komsomolskaya Pravda from one end to the other in excessive and tedious abundance, at the same time that this newspaper is leading the chorus for sanctions against workers, peasants, and intellectuals whose positions differ from those of the bureaucracy of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party Soviet Union Bolsheviks. And who are those who, deafened by these slogans about, quote, freedom of criticism and, quote, self-criticism, languish in prison or in internal deportation without ever having been tried or convicted in a real court of law, those whose road led them to Berezovka, Obdorsk, and Turyansk, where a slow-motion death sentence awaits them? Are they not those same proletarians, peasants, and intellectuals who dare to criticize this system of all-embracing power, of violence and of bureaucratic impunity and arbitrariness? Footnote. Berezovka, Obdorsk, parenthesis, today known as Salakhard, in parenthesis, are Turojansk, and Turojansk are Siberian cities. End footnote. We must make the broad masses of workers participate in this purgative self-criticism, in the elimination of all the obstacles that stand in the way of the road to freedom of criticism, end quote, according to the Komsomolskaya Pravda, in an article titled Open Season on Bureaucratism by Way of Criticism, published in June 13th, 1928. But what are these, quote, obstacles that stand in the way of the road to freedom of criticism, end quote? First of all, the secret repression against the dissident workers, peasants, and intellectuals in the dungeons of the GPU. Then, the absence of a right to engage in organized, systematic, and comprehensive criticism as a group or party. The third, quote, obstacle is the fact that the right of criticism from their own point of view, on the basis of their own platform or program, is denied to the workers, peasants, and intellectuals, and so is the right to publish magazines or books that are not official or social bureaucratic publications. Honorable bureaucrat editors of Komsomolskaya Pravda, are you in favor of eliminating these, quote, obstacles? Or perhaps you would prefer your bureaucrat editors of the newspapers and magazines to loudly proclaim your support for the, quote, elimination of all the obstacles that stand in the way of freedom of criticism, end quote. While, serenaded by your noise, the bureaucrats in charge of the dungeons of the GPU listen to the screams of the workers, peasants, and intellectuals who do not agree with you, you bureaucratic scribblers of editorials, parenthesis, such as those of Komsomolskaya Pravda. Do you expect that the workers will allow themselves to be fooled by all this claptrap about, quote, freedom of criticism, end quote? No, this second-hand sophistry will not succeed. Quote, the problem is that many workers do not believe that there is no risk in criticizing the leadership. And even more importantly, that the, quote, exercise of criticism, end quote, is not dangerous. When the bureaucrats of the past cut according to a standard pattern and a petty tyrant is completely transformed overnight into a faithful devotee of self-criticism, the worker cannot immediately trust him and surrender his soul to him, end quote. According to Komsomolskaya Pravda. We could not agree more. The workers cannot trust the bureaucrat who is cut according to the standard pattern of the past, nor can the workers trust the bureaucrat cut according to the standard pattern of our time. The bureaucrat who only abides by the division of labor. One is responsible for the dissident workers, peasants and intellectuals in the silence of the dungeons of the GPU, secretly hidden from the sight of the proletariat, while the other, cut according to the standard pattern of newspaper editors, writes that we have freedom of criticism and conceals the activities of the GPU. Not so long ago, the bureaucrats cut according to the pattern of Komsomolskaya Pravda were calling for sanctions against the opposition and against all the workers, peasants, and intellectuals who adopted a position of organized criticism against the bureaucratic dictatorship, against its violence and its impunity. But today this flock of scribblers fanatically agitates for, quote, freedom of criticism and lauds the, quote, faithful devotees of self-criticism, and sheds tears because, quote, the problem is that many workers do not believe that there is no risk in criticizing, end quote, and have no trust at all in this bureaucratic rehash in the latest style. Good. You are completely correct, comrade workers. Do not trust the vacuous words of the bureaucracy. Until the GPU's secret repression directed against the dissident workers, peasants, and intellectuals comes to an end, until these workers, peasants, and intellectuals have the right to publish newspapers, magazines, and books that espouse different ideas than the bureaucracy. As long as these workers, peasants, and intellectuals are rotting in prison and in internal deportation, where they have been dragged by the bureaucracy that is today jabbering away about freedom of criticism, until the bureaucracy concedes these guarantees, until then no one should believe this flock of scribblers and charlatans who chatter about freedom of criticism. Obviously, the workers, peasants, and intellectuals will take advantage of every opportunity that arises to unmask impostors, embezzlers, and petty tyrants, but as it does so, it will always keep in mind that really putting an end to the dictatorship, of divine right, of violence, of tyranny and exploitation will not be possible unless the proletariat seizes power. That is, unless, quote, the proletariat bracket is raised, end bracket, to the position of ruling class to win the battle of democracy, end quote. Only then will the proletariat organize as a class in the councils of workers' deputies administer production instead of the bureaucracy. Only then, organized into cooperatives, will it assume responsibility for distribution instead of the bureaucratic commercial institutions of the state. Only then, organized in its trade unions, will it take over the rights and responsibilities of the bureaucratic workers and peasants inspectorate. Only then will the workers' councils, in alliance with the Soviets of peasant delegates and the urban Soviets, actually administer the state. And only then will the proletariat have the right to form parties, freedom of association, and freedom of expression, of the press and of assembly, in much greater extent than in the freest of the bourgeois states. For the first time in the history of humanity, all these centuries of class societies, the exploited will finally be really free. This is the only way to put an end to the all-embracing power, to the violence, to the divine right, and to the tyranny of the bureaucracy. Workers, raise the battle flag of the Communist Manifesto and join the fight. Remember that, quote, the emancipation of the workers must be the task of the workers themselves, end quote. There is no supreme savior, no God, no Caesar, no tribune. Producers, do it yourselves. Proclaim universal salvation. They will put us in jail. They will torture us with fire. They will deport us to the mines. They will assassinate us. That is how it will be. In the end, the workers will be victorious. Exclamation point. And that is the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.